We have Analiese Gregory. She is a chef, author, and forager from Tasmania, Australia. She is someone from previous Worlds of Flavor that we brought back. Everyone loved her. And I'll just tell you very quickly about her story. We're going to be having a conversation while she cooks. And we're going to see a very quick video before she starts. But Analise is someone who grew up, spent a couple of years, she grew up on a dairy farm, spent a couple of years driving around Australia with her family, and she'll correct me if I get any of this wrong, but she stopped going to school when she was like 15 because she's very smart, and then she went to cooking school for a couple of years. And I think she ended up having an experience that a lot of chefs or students in culinary schools have, in that very young she started working in Michelin-starred fine dining restaurants and really making a name for herself and a reputation for being an excellent chef. She worked, for example, at Quay in Sydney, Australia. And she kind of had, the career that a lot of people dream of. And then she left it and she decided to move to Tasmania. She continued cooking. She took on a job as a head chef at a restaurant called Franklin's that's in Hobart. And then I think the pandemic came, and she just sort of reevaluated her life. She's done some other things, some TV things, and believes that everyone can find a sense of adventure in cooking. And so she's going to talk about this experience. She's going to demo some great recipes. But first, we're going to watch a short video.
I'm Analiese Gregory, and from the age of 16, I've been traveling all over the planet to work with the world's best chefs. It's a journey that's brought me here to country Tasmania. Nanny, what are you doing? You think that you're in charge? Foraging, diving, hunting. It's what gives my cooking and my life here extra meaning. So I had never eaten abalone like this before. It's super fresh, sashimi style. So good. I want to cook everything over fire.
And these are homemade cheeses.
Well, if I can do it, you can do it.
A Girl's Guide to Hunting, Fishing and Wild Cooking starts Thursday, 18th of November on SBS Food and On Demand.
Okay, help me welcome Analiese Gregory.
Hi. Oh, okay.
You're
All
on.
right,
You're
straight on, just like that. Hi, I'm Analise, and I'm a chef originally from New Zealand, but I live in Tasmania. I've been there for about 6 years. And I suppose for me, when I first moved to Tassie, I was cooking mainly, Franglish food because, that was how I was trained in France and England in like Michelin restaurants. And then I really started to think about what does Tasmania taste like? What is the terroir of where I'm living? I became more and more interested in foraging and things like this when, back in the day, I used to think foraging was just for hipsters from Noma. And then I discovered that I actually really enjoyed it. And that it was very meditative for me, same as diving. So I'm not someone that can actually meditate or do anything like that. My mind's just working too much. But I do find that going out in nature and picking things gives me the same effects. And, and you're collecting stuff for your pantry at the same time. So it's kind of a win-win situation. One of the first things I started doing when I moved to Tassie was diving. Prior to that, I was always holiday diver, go to the Barrier Reef. And go down. And then I was when I was living in Sydney, I was no, it's too cold, I'm not into it. And then I moved to Tasmania, which is one of the coldest, darkest places on earth, and suddenly start going. But the drive was mainly the fact that, you can jump into the ocean there and get sea urchin, you can get abalone, seaweed, you can get lobsters, and it's pretty easy, to be honest with you. And it's kind of pristine. I've never been diving and seen a water bottle or plastic, for instance. And I know that that's wild in the world that we have today, that's not normal. But so one of the things I became really obsessed with when I was diving was seaweed. So I'll go down and I was like, okay, there's abalone and like snails and things, but like there's so many plants down here. Why are we not using them? Why is no one using them? And at the same time, I was going through a process of trying to change the basis of my cooking into things that came from Tasmania. So Tasmania is a small island at the bottom of the world with really strict quarantine. Everything that's not from Tassie gets fumigated upon entry. So it makes sense to use things from Tasmania. So like most people at that stage, I was using a lot of kombu and white soy and things like this as bases for umami. And I tried to start sourcing those things from Tasmania. So one of the things I found was wakame. So in Tassie, wakame is from Japan originally. It's an invasive species in Tassie. So it's in the ocean. It shouldn't be there. It's taking the habitat of native species. And this is just like a really small wakame. Normally when I'm diving, they're like 3 to 4 meters. Like they're much bigger than I am. And so, I started picking it. And then I realized that there was so much more to it. So like with the wakame, there's the leaves, then there's the central stem or the stipe, and then at the base you have like the fruiting base of the plant with the holdfast called the mekabu, and they all have completely different textures. So it makes sense to treat them in different ways. So I started realizing that there was just way more to it than I had previously thought from like dried packets of wakame from the Japanese supermarket, and I started experimenting with it heaps at work. One of the things that I came to find that I really loved was making, I call it wakame jam. It's based off, like a Kyoto-style condiment where they braise down, look at all the algae coming off it, where they braise down all of the kombu that's left from making dashi with like soy sauce, some sake, some mirin, and make it into a condiment in its own right. So also, because of all of like the mucilaginous qualities of wakame, it also turns it into something that basically makes any sauce want to emulsify, which is a really good base for cooking. So I take the mekabu, that's just seaweed and water, there's nothing else in there, and then throw in, so I go like a little bit of soy, some sake, some mirin, and then I top it up with water. And just braise it down like that until it's completely soft. Sometimes I do it in a pressure cooker to make it faster. On the stove, it probably does take about 3 hours. Then I drain it, chop it all up, and reduce everything down together. And then you get something that looks kind of disgusting like this, but I promise you it's super umami rich and really delicious. So that's what I call wakame jam, and it's the base of a lot of my sauces and like the base umami ingredient in a lot of the cooking that I do. So I've moved away from using like dashi and things like that to be more seaweed focused. So then while I'm in the ocean, diving, I'm just going to turn this one on.
And can you just talk a little bit about that process of diving? And how, I don't know anything about seaweed, I think so. And I don't know if there's any diving experts out here, but I mean, what does that process look like? Like, how do you have to get ready for that? What are you looking for? Is it just you can come upon any seaweed and harvest that? Is seaweed something, the wakame, is it something that you have to think about harvesting sustainably?
Yes, all of those things. So first of all, technically, any seaweed is edible. There's differing levels of deliciousness amongst the seaweeds, and there's some that, if you eat too much, you will get sick. But so you can pretty much eat any of them. They're not all as tasty as each other, and like some are invasive and some are from there. So the main thing about removing wakame from Tasmania is that it came over in the ballast water of Japanese whaling ships like 100, 200 years ago. So it's not meant to be in the environment, but it thrives in like the cold coastal waters of Tassie. I think of foraging seaweed the same way as I think about like foraging mushrooms. It's like, you've got to learn to be able to identify them. And I guess kind of the more time you spend underwater and the more time you spend like looking at and thinking about seaweed, the easier that becomes, where you're like, okay, it's red, is it adults? You know, what do the fronds look like? Like, let's look at a book. There's not that much literature out there to help with that, unfortunately. There's a few books around.
There's
mostly,
probably a great oral tradition, like that's people.
yeah. So I spent a lot of time like bugging marine biologists and being like, hey, is this what I think it is? But it's the same thing as like, you know, once you can identify pine mushroom, like, you know, once I identify wakame, now I see it everywhere. And once you identify sea lettuce, suddenly you see it everywhere. And then I'm like, okay, that's the red variety. And you slowly build on your repertoire of like what you know is there and what you know is safe to use and that you like to use. Like bull kelp, I'll dry and I'll use it the same way that you use kombu, in that I'll just like put it into, you know, I'll make a dashi with it essentially and just use it in stocks. But like it in itself is like, it's so leathery and it takes so long to become tender that it's just not pleasant. And then in terms of harvesting them sustainably, yes, wakame, happy to take out of the ocean because it's invasive, along with the long-spined sea urchins in Tassie. But always think about like where you're harvesting it from. Generally, like don't pull the hold fast. You don't want to, which is where the seaweed itself attaches to itself to the seabed or to a rock. You don't want to be like changing the floor of the ocean, essentially. In Tasmania, it's legal to take as much as you want if it's beach cast or like ocean cast, so if it's not attached. But every country has different rules and regulations on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so something that eats seaweed is actually abalone, which is the next thing that there's heaps of in Tasmania. So this is a Blackfoot abalone. I think serving abalone and seaweed together was just kind of one of those, you know, if it grows together, it goes together kind of moments. So an abalone, it's a mollusk, it's a large grazing sea snail. So I kind of think of them as the cows of the sea. And this is a raw one, and this is one that I cooked earlier. So it's wrapped in seaweed. So I steam it wrapped in seaweed just with a little bit of sake. So with abalone, it's very tense. It can be a very tense protein. So I go with like, it's either a super long cook or a super short cook. So it's either a couple of seconds or it's more like hours. Those are the ways to tenderize it. The other way is like, you know, the bashing, like with the rock on the beach, which a lot of people still do in Tasmania. But I feel like that's, you know, that's not respecting the ingredient. So I don't tend to go down that road. So the other thing I like about the long cooking of abalone is, so I cook it in the shell with the seaweed and then like, it comes straight out of the shell. It makes it really easy to clean. As anyone who's ever cleaned abalone before knows that, you know, it can get all over your kitchen. It can be a really messy experience. So then you can literally just like pull off the guts. This piece is the liver, if you can see up there. So I often separate that. The liver makes a delicious sauce. So I'll just blend it into a stock, maybe some seaweed, some butter. That makes an amazing sauce to go over abalone. Or I dehydrate them and mix it with salt and make like an abalone liver salt, which sounds gross, but it really just tastes like the sea. It's actually quite delicious. And then, yeah, that is literally it. And that is like the fastest and easiest way to clean an abalone that I've found. Cool. So for this dish, I'm just going to give this a little bit of a wipe. I'm going to steal some of that juice back in a sec. Okay. And we're going to make a seaweed sabayon. So we're going to make a wakame sabayon. So I've got some egg yolks here. I'm going with a little bit of mushroom soy. My grandmother was Cantonese, so I still sometimes can't get away from the Chinese ingredients. I love them. And then abalone stock, so basically the cooking liquid from the abalone. Ooh, whisking a little bit too vigorously there, HB. Okay. Oh no, it's okay. So I'm just going to make traditional sabayon, and then I'm going to throw some clarified butter into it. So it's basically a hollandaise with no acid. And it's really just like a fatty, eggy foil to dip the abalone in, essentially.
So we have a question from the audience. What is the best way to remove the sand when harvesting wild seaweed?
Oh,
And is that a difficult thing?
sorry.
Is that a difficult thing to remove the sand from when you're harvesting wild seaweed?
It can be. I try not to get sand on it in the first place because once you do, it can be difficult to get off. There was one time I actually had my entire bath full of seaweed trying to get the sand off it. I was like, I'm just going to run this with cold water and I'll just soak it. These days, if I need to wash it, I generally make a brine or I'll take fresh seawater from the ocean because I do feel like in the washing of the seaweed, you do lose something. But yes, washing is the way to get the sand off. Try not to stick it on the beach. Like take a dive bag or something and just carry it around.
And so is there a culture around eating seaweed in Tasmania, or do people not want to engage with it because it's seen as with the wakame as an invasive species?
There hasn't been a strong culture of it in the past. There was a small culture of using the bull kelp with the indigenous people, but not a lot of really eating it. But it's something that I'm hoping changes with time. Unfortunately, there's a, large salmon farming industry in Tasmania, which is not great for the environment. And I'm like, my ideal situation is that all the salmon farms change to seaweed farms, because seaweed is one of the few foods that the growing of actually has a positive environmental impact. Seaweed itself, like it removes toxins from the ocean, and they can absorb up to 20% more carbon than they put out. So it has a positive effect as opposed to a negative one. So I'm all for people eating more seaweed. Plus, it's delicious.
And it's a really versatile ingredient, yes, because we had a chef from Connecticut who worked with sugar kelp, and he did a demo where he did this really beautiful dessert. So it seems like both in terms of the seaweed is just a win-win, right? Like it's sustainable. Yeah. It's got all that umami flavor, and it's a really versatile ingredient. You can use it fresh, you can use it dried. Like there's just a lot of, you can freeze it and then, let it thaw, and it still, is holding its texture.
You can use it to make ice cream, like the algin keeps ice cream bases, with very few crystals. And in terms of the wakame, I tend to use the leaves for salads and noodle dishes and things like that. The stem I'll pickle and use as a pickled vegetable because it's got a completely different texture. So I'll use it in a mignonette for oysters or something like that. And then the mekaboo itself, which in the beginning was the hardest part to find a use for, has now become the most useful part for me because I preserve it and then use that instead of kombu, miso, all of those things. Sorry, please excuse me while I try not to split a hollandaise on stage. Okay, nearly there.
Well, if I ask another question, will it ruin your concentration?
No, it will not. It will be fine, I promise.
Okay. So something that I wanted to ask you, and we talked about this a little bit before at your book signing, and if you haven't had a chance, Analise has just a really beautiful book all around called How Wild Things Are. And I think it was written early 2020. Maybe it was a little bit pre-pandemic, but really just talks about her story and some recipes, but also her relationship with the land. And something that is talked about in the book is that this idea of what people eat in Tasmania, like that there might be like a disconnection, and talking about, we're thinking about authenticity here and pushing and pulling that concept. And so had talked about wallaby and kangaroo specifically, that you on your menus had offered that, and there might be a little bit of pushback, and you were hoping that people would sort of change. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. To be honest, I actually wanted to cook wallaby here, and it's illegal in California. The thing is, and something that like people outside of Australia might not realize, is like, yes, they're cute, fluffy creatures, and like, yes, I like cute things too, but eating like kangaroo or wallaby in Australia, it's actually the most sustainable form of meat that we have. So it's not legal to farm them, so they're only in the wild. They don't, have cloven hooves. They don't like hurt the paddocks or the land. Like they've been designed essentially to live in that country and to eat from that country. And now, with the absence in Tasmania, we have no dingoes, we have no Tasmanian tigers anymore. So wallabies have no natural predators apart from man. So now they're in nearly plague proportions. So it's literally farmers will just shoot them and just leave them in the paddock. Like you're allowed to shoot them to protect your crops and your livestock. And to me, I would rather see something be eaten and go into the food chain than just be left to rot. So that, again, is kind of a no-brainer. Plus, they are also delicious. If I had to...
Because you serve it raw, right?
Yeah, people always ask me what it tastes like, and it's kind of like if a rabbit and a deer had a love child. So pretty lean because they're wild. But yeah, like wallabies are actually not that gamey. Like it's quite like a soft meat. When I used to have the restaurant in Hobart, one of my chef friends came over and he was like, oh, I'm gonna cook dinner. I was like, okay, great. I was like, grab something from the fridge. And then later that night at my house, I was like, this is wallaby. He was like, yeah, I'm cooking you lamb. I was like, this is totally a wallaby rump and not a lamb rump. And he actually had no idea, he didn't know. I was like, okay, so not that different after all. I think that's something that like, it can be a bit of a hard sell though. Like people do just think of them and they think of the like, small, cute, fuzzy creatures. And yes, there is that aspect to it. But then there's also the aspect of, there's so many issues with agriculture at the moment that why would we not be using something that's sustainable, is environmentally friendly, and we have lots of it. So it just seems to make sense. Okay, so we've made the sabayon, we've got the wakame jam, and then in terms of abalone, I tend to leave all of the frills and things on when I'm doing abalone. I feel like, again, when you're like, especially when I dive for something and when you see it out in nature, you become hyper aware of, it's a whole creature. It's not just the central part of the abalone and not the frills. So I used to work in all of these fine dining restaurants where if you prepped an abalone, I would take little sponges and would scrub them until they were all white and you couldn't tell what it was. And then would trim all of this piece off. But for me, the animal just has this kind of 3 different textures to it. So like particularly when it's raw, the foot, this piece here, is really good as sashimi. Then there's the base where it attaches to the rocks, which is denser, and then the frill and the pieces around the side are a lot more gelatinous. And especially when you heat them up, they kind of, like they curl up and they're just really soft and gelatinous and beautiful. So these were all things that I used to have on the menu when I was running a restaurant called Franklin in Hobart until the pandemic when it closed. And then now I'm in the process of building a 10-seater restaurant at my farm in the Huron Valley, which is very, very far south in Tasmania. So I guess that means it's very far south in terms of the world.
And so is there, it sounds to me like a lot of rural places where you might have really strong connections with your neighbors. I think of farming communities. I grew up in the Midwest, and where maybe you might not have a store for 45 minutes, but you definitely have your neighbors. And is that the kind of place that Tasmania is? Do you have that connection with your neighbors?
Oh, it definitely is. I didn't have that connection until COVID because although I had a house in the countryside, I just used to, like I treated it like a hotel, like a weird country hotel. I would just like come and go. Until COVID, when I was forced to stay home, and because I'm unable to like only cook food for one person, all of my neighbors suddenly started receiving like a lot of food from me. And my stock went up. It became quite high. And now I know one set of my neighbors, one of them is he's a natural wine distributor in Tasmania, so wine distributor living next to a chef. It is a match made in heaven, and now we raise pigs together. He's planting a vineyard up behind our houses, and there are moments where it really is that like idyllic kind of life that I envisaged and wanted before moving there.
And we have just a few minutes left, but that leads me to asking you, and we've got a couple more minutes beyond that timer. Okay. We just are tricky that way. Where I'm thinking about the story that's in How Wild Things Are, and your story is about having, I think, what people would see as you had it all, like you were working, you were young, you were working in fine dining restaurants, and then you kind of left it all behind, and it seems like you are more and more trying to be connected to nature and to find what would be maybe an authentic life, the kind of life that you want to lead. And I was thinking about, we did a breakout session with Chef Diego Galicia, who talked about authenticity beyond just the menu, right? Like this idea of like, what is a chef's life like? And, sort of pushing back against the 16-hour days, the stress of it. And I thought that was a really sort of beautiful part of your book, where you're very vulnerable and you talk about having anxiety and that you're a chef because you have anxiety. And so can you talk about that process of kind of leaving that all behind?
It was one of the most nerve-wracking things that I've ever done. It probably took me a few years to come to the realization that I wanted something more from cooking and from my life. Like I was always just that person that like I lived in London, Paris, Sydney, San Sebastian, and like all just for restaurants. Like I wanted to work in a restaurant, I would travel to where it was and I would work there. And always, normally like 12 to 16 hours a day. And it wasn't really until COVID. It was kind of that proper COVID reset thing of, I realized that I was like traveling for 2 hours a day to get to work, and that my goats would always escape when I wasn't there, and my neighbors hated me, and that things just weren't really working, not in the way that I wanted them to. I was trying to run the small farm in the countryside and also work full-time in the fine dining restaurant, and I was just always in the shit, like in life and, outside of the kitchen and in the kitchen. So yeah, in one of those days on the couch when you weren't allowed to leave the house, I just started to think about, what if my work was like closer to home? What if I didn't travel for 2 hours a day to get to work? And then, kind of realized that I would have to diversify, that I wasn't going to be able to, just be a head chef anymore in restaurants. And that I would have to find other ways.
All right, and so this is a great point for you to plate up. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so I'm gonna sort of step back and let you finish that.
Okay, and so this is, there we go. So black clip abalone steamed with sake and with a Wakame sabayon, both things that I have dived for in Tasmania. There you go.
Well, thank you, Chef. This was a wonderful, informative demo. And again, Analise has a book where How Wild Things Are. And the Wakame butter will be served as part of a scallop dish at the Friday marketplace, I believe.
Oh yeah, tomorrow at the marketplace I will be serving this on American scallops.
Oh, we look
Cooked on
forward
a
to that.
hibachi, because normally I'm cooking over fire in Tasmania.
Well, wonderful. So let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you.